Code blue in ER3. The patient isn't bleeding or choking. He's screaming about magnets. Not just any magnets, 37 rare earth ones, now warping his intestines like a Salvador Dali painting. This collector didn't just swallow danger, he devoured a force stronger than his own body. By the time surgeons opened him up, his organs had begun fusing together. As an emergency physician for 15 years, I've witnessed countless medical oddities, but this case would redefine my understanding of human curiosity gone wrong. The human digestive system, normally resilient against common foreign objects, was about to meet its match against the laws of physics themselves. The human body is remarkably resilient, designed to process a wide variety of substances and occasionally foreign objects. But what happens when those objects possess forces that can overcome biological barriers? The answer was about to unfold before me in a case that would redefine the boundaries between physics and medicine. As I prepared for my night shift, I couldn't have imagined that basic magnetic principles taught in high school science would soon become a matter of life and death. The call came in at 3:47 a.m., a 32-year-old male, clutching his abdomen, sweating profusely. As the attending physician, I've seen countless cases of abdominal pain, but something about this one felt different. His vitals were peculiar, heart rate through the roof, yet blood pressure holding steady. The emergency department that night was unusually quiet, which made his arrival even more dramatic. His screams echoed through the corridors as the paramedics wheeled him in. The night shift nurse, Sarah, immediately noticed his unusual posture, hunched forward, arms wrapped tightly around his midsection, as if holding something inside. When she attempted to help him lie back, he let out a cry that brought our security guard running. "Please," he begged, "don't make me move. They'll tear me apart." His medical history offered no red flags, no psychiatric episodes, no previous surgeries, not even a history of digestive issues. The paramedics reported he lived alone in an apartment filled with scientific collectibles. They found him on the bathroom floor, surrounded by empty display cases and collector certificates for high-grade neodymium magnets. His apartment, as described by the paramedics, was a testament to his obsession. Shelves lined with carefully arranged magnets, each in its own display case with detailed specifications. Notebooks filled with calculations of magnetic fields and interaction strengths. They found his laptop open to forums discussing the theoretical limits of magnetic force that human tissue could withstand. The paramedics also noted several empty display cases, their certification cards still attached, showing purchase dates spread over the past month. What struck me most was the methodical nature of his collection. Each magnet had been carefully catalogued with its magnetic field strength, origin, and date of acquisition. Some entries included complex diagrams showing magnetic field interactions. These weren't the scribblings of a madman, but the precise documentation of someone who understood exactly what he possessed. This level of knowledge made what followed even more disturbing. When the paramedics wheeled him in, he was doubled over, refusing to lie flat. "It moves," he kept saying. "It moves when I lie down." The nurses tried to help him onto the bed, but he resisted, insisting on staying hunched forward. Through gritted teeth, he denied ingesting anything unusual, but his body language screamed otherwise. The initial physical examination proved nearly impossible. Each time I attempted to palpate his abdomen, he would flinch away, insisting that any pressure made the pain worse. Through careful observation, I noticed something peculiar. His pain seemed to shift and intensify when he moved near metal objects. The stainless steel bed rails, the IV pole, even the zipper on his jacket appeared to influence his discomfort. It was as if his body had become a compass, responding to every metallic surface in the room. The pain patterns were unlike anything in standard medical texts. He described it as crawling and pulling. Sensations that shifted with his body position. Each movement brought new waves of agony, accompanied by an audible grinding sound from his abdomen that even the nurses could hear when pressing the stethoscope to his skin. I ordered an immediate X-ray, standard protocol for unexplained abdominal pain. The technician's face told me everything before I even saw the images. "Doctor, you need to see this." The scan revealed what looked like a metallic constellation inside his digestive tract. Dozens of perfectly round, dense objects clustered together in his small intestine. The emergency department fell silent as the images appeared on our screens. Several nurses who had been preparing standard protocols for foreign body removal stopped in their tracks. One of our senior staff members, who had handled everything from embedded glass to swallowed razor blades, whispered, "Dear God." The magnets weren't just sitting there, they were actively reaching for each other through layers of living tissue. The X-ray images were unlike anything in our medical database. Each magnet showed up as a brilliant white dot, but the surrounding tissue told a more disturbing story. The intestinal walls, normally visible as soft gray lines, were distorted into sharp angles where the magnets pulled them together. In some areas, the tissue had been compressed so tightly it was barely visible on the scan. Our senior radiologist, with 30 years of experience, admitted he'd only seen similar patterns in industrial accidents involving magnetic machinery. The magnets had formed 3 distinct clusters, each roughly the size of a golf ball. But most alarming was their position. They weren't simply sitting in the intestinal tract. The magnetic force had drawn them together through multiple layers of tissue, creating a complex web of compressed and distorted organs. Our radiologist, Da Chen, pointed to dark spaces between the clusters. "Those aren't gaps," she said grimly. "That's where the intestinal walls have been pulled together." The morphine finally loosened his tongue. Between labored breaths, he confessed. He was a collector of rare earth magnets, specifically neodymium, the strongest permanent magnets commercially available. Over the past week, he'd been swallowing them one by one, convinced they would pass through naturally like coins or buttons. He revealed the magnets were part of a 12,000 collection, rare earth specimens from Japan, each certified for their exceptional magnetic strength. The certification papers in his wallet boasted pull forces exceeding 1 to 200 Gauss. At those levels, 2 magnets could easily trap and crush human tissue between them with the force of a bite from a large dog. His collecting habits had started innocently enough, a fascination with physics and magnetism that began in college. Over the years, it evolved from simple experiments to an obsession with acquiring the world's most powerful commercial magnets. He spoke of his collection with a mixture of pride and scientific precision, detailing the unique properties of each piece. Some were so powerful they required special storage containers with magnetic shielding. The thought that these same magnificent specimens were now wreaking havoc inside his body seemed to cause him as much distress as the physical pain itself. Each magnet was a masterpiece of metallurgy, manufactured to precise specifications in specialized facilities. These weren't toys or simple refrigerator magnets. They were industrial-grade rare earth magnets, each capable of lifting several hundred times their own weight. The certification papers detailed their composition: neodymium, iron, and boron, formed under intense pressure and heat to create the most powerful permanent magnets known to science. In his delirious state, he kept mumbling about their magnetic field strength, proud of their specifications even as they were destroying him from the inside. The irony wasn't lost on me. These magnets, designed for scientific research and industrial applications, were now conducting an unauthorized experiment in human biology. Each piece represented the pinnacle of magnetic engineering, created in sterile laboratories under strict quality control. Now they were turning a human digestive system into their own chaotic laboratory. What he hadn't counted on was their powerful attraction to each other. These weren't ordinary magnets. Each one packed enough force to pinch flesh between them with devastating force. Inside his intestines, they were playing a deadly game of attraction, pulling through the walls of his digestive tract, creating potential points of perforation. The initial blood work revealed early signs of tissue death, elevated white blood cell count, rising lactate levels. Each minute brought us closer to potential sepsis. The magnets weren't just sitting idle, they were actively destroying the very tissues meant to transport them. Small pools of blood were likely forming in the compressed spaces, creating perfect breeding grounds for bacteria. I immediately paged surgery. The head surgeon's voice crackled over the intercom. "Keep him absolutely still. Don't let him lie flat. Any movement caused those magnets to shift and tear through tissue." The patient's face went pale as reality set in. His prize collection was now a series of ticking time bombs inside his body. The surgical team began assembling in the conference room, reviewing the X-rays with growing concern. Each surgeon brought a different perspective to the table, but all agreed this was unprecedented. The head of gastroenterology pointed out areas where the magnets had already created small perforations. The vascular surgeon identified compromised blood vessels pinched between the magnetic clusters. Even our most experienced attending surgeon, who had removed everything from swallowers, mistakes to holiday decorations, looked genuinely worried. The hospital's risk management team was quickly brought into the loop. This case presented unprecedented challenges, not just medically, but from a safety and liability standpoint. The magnetic forces involved were strong enough to potentially affect medical equipment throughout the surgical suite. Our biomedical engineering department had to be consulted to assess the risks to vital monitoring equipment. Even the surgical lights, mounted on metal arms above the operating table, could potentially be affected by the powerful magnetic fields emanating from the patient's abdomen. The surgical planning room buzzed with tension as specialists debated various approaches. Traditional surgical techniques wouldn't work. Any metal instrument brought near the magnetic clusters could become a deadly projectile. The head surgeon sketched possible incision sites on a whiteboard, mapping out a strategy that would require perfect coordination between multiple teams. Time was critical, but rushing could prove fatal. We activated our hospital's rare earth hazard protocol. Originally designed for MRI accidents, all ferromagnetic equipment was removed from the planned transport route to the OR. Security was posted to keep people with metal objects away from the patient's path. Even the gurney had to be specially certified as non-magnetic to prevent any interaction with the powerful forces inside him. The nurses began prep for emergency surgery, but we all knew this was uncharted territory. These weren't just foreign bodies to be extracted, they were actively dangerous objects that could cause catastrophic damage during removal. The surgical team would need to innovate on the fly, dealing with magnetic forces that could turn surgical instruments into projectiles. The operating room itself had to be specially prepared. Every metal instrument within a 6-foot radius of the operating table was removed. The anesthesiologist had to modify their standard equipment setup, keeping the metal components of their machinery at a safe distance. Nurses laid out alternative polymer-based tools, knowing that traditional metal instruments could become dangerous projectiles if they got too close to the magnetic masses. The surgical team even practiced with dummy magnets, testing how close they could bring their instruments before the magnetic pull became dangerous. The operating room began to resemble a hybrid between a surgical suite and a hazardous materials containment zone. Special electromagnetic monitoring equipment was brought in to measure the strength of the magnetic fields. The surgical team would need to work within strict safety zones, marked out on the floor with colored tape. Each person in the room would need to be screened for any metal objects. Even a forgotten paperclip in a pocket could become dangerous. The surgical department called in their most experienced team, but even they seemed daunted by the challenge ahead. Standard surgical tools would be useless. The magnets would grab them, potentially causing more damage. They needed specialized titanium instruments, normally reserved for delicate brain surgery. Time was running out, and the equipment had to be brought in from another hospital across town. As we rushed him toward the OR, he grabbed my arm. "I just wanted to feel them working inside me," he whispered. "I wanted to be part of the magnetic field." The admission sent chills down my spine. In all my years of emergency medicine, I'd never encountered someone who had deliberately turned their body into a magnetic playground. The radiologist's hands trembled as she manipulated the X-ray images on her screen. "I can't get an accurate count," she admitted, frustration evident in her voice. "The magnetic fields are distorting our imaging. They're clustering like iron filings around a magnet. We couldn't risk an MRI. The powerful magnetic field would have torn the patient apart from the inside." The imaging challenges we faced were unprecedented. Traditional radiological markers became useless as the magnetic fields created dark zones where vital anatomical information should have been. Each attempt to adjust the imaging parameters only revealed new complications. The magnetic interference patterns resembled a strange, abstract artwork, beautiful in their complexity but terrifying in their implications for our patient's survival. The distortion pattern on the screen told a story of chaos. Each magnet created its own interference field, making it impossible to distinguish individual objects. What appeared as one large mass could be 3 or 4 separate magnets, their fields merging into a single dark void on our screens. The patient's soft tissue structures, normally clearly visible on X-ray, were obscured by these magnetic artifacts, leaving us partially blind to the full extent of the damage. I called in our senior radiologist, Dr. Chen, for a second opinion. His decades of experience had never encountered a case quite like this. The magnetic fields are creating what we call susceptibility artifacts, he explained, pointing to dark voids in the image where the magnets disrupted our scanning capabilities. Each magnet is essentially creating its own force field, distorting not just our imaging but the surrounding tissue structure. All the standard protocols we relied on daily were useless here. Each attempt at imaging brought new challenges. The radiographic density of the magnets created artifacts that obscured crucial anatomical details. I'd seen plenty of foreign body cases in my career, batteries, coins, even small toys, but nothing had prepared me for this. The magnets weren't just sitting there, they were actively moving, creating a dynamic problem that our static imaging couldn't fully capture. The CT scan revealed the true horror of our situation. The magnets had formed 3 main clusters, one in the upper jejunum, another in the middle ileum, and a third group straddling both sections. The force between them was literally pulling sections of intestine together, creating unnatural bridges of tissue. Using contrast-enhanced imaging, we identified several areas where the intestinal walls had already begun to deteriorate. The magnets had created pressure points that resembled tiny vices, squeezing the delicate tissue between them with relentless force. In some locations, the wall thickness had been reduced to mere millimeters, a hair's breadth away from complete perforation. The patient's intestinal walls, normally supple and mobile, had become rigid anchor points where the magnets gathered. These clusters weren't static, they shifted with each breath, each movement causing micro tears in the delicate mucosal lining. The mesenteric blood vessels, crucial for nutrient absorption and blood supply, were being compressed and twisted in ways that threatened tissue viability. Blood flow mapping showed concerning patterns of vascular compression. Areas that should have been receiving normal perfusion were showing signs of ischemia. The magnetic forces weren't just affecting the intestinal walls, they were compromising the entire circulatory network of the digestive system. Small capillaries were being pinched shut, while larger vessels were being stretched and distorted beyond their normal anatomical positions. The 3D reconstruction revealed the full extent of the damage. These weren't just simple perforations or blockages, the magnets had created an intricate network of pressure points throughout the digestive tract. The patient's internal anatomy had been transformed into a complex web of attracted metal and compressed tissue. Each breath he took caused subtle shifts in the magnetic field, creating new points of contact and fresh areas of concern. Look at this. I pointed to a particularly concerning area. 2 loops of intestine had been drawn so close together that the tissue between them was practically white from lack of blood flow. The magnets were acting like tiny clamps, creating pressure points that threatened to necrotize the tissue. Each cluster had become its own epicenter of destruction. When one magnet moved, it pulled others with it, creating a cascade effect through the digestive tract. The patient's normal peristaltic movements, the natural contractions of the intestines, were working against us, causing the magnets to shift and create new points of damage with each passing minute. Using sequential imaging, we tracked the movement of several clusters over just 5 minutes. The largest group had migrated nearly 2 centimeters, dragging a section of jejunum with it. The intestinal wall, normally flexible and adaptive, was being stretched to its structural limits. Microscopic tears were likely already forming in areas where the tissue strain exceeded biological tolerance. We brought in a medical physicist to help us understand the forces at play. Using specialized equipment, he measured the magnetic field strength around the patient's abdomen. The readings were alarming. These rare earth magnets were exponentially stronger than typical refrigerator magnets, generating forces that could easily compress and damage internal organs. The physicist's face grew grave as he calculated the pressure points. "These forces," he said, "are strong enough to cause immediate tissue necrosis where the magnets meet." But the physicist's calculations revealed another disturbing factor. The magnetic force increased exponentially as the objects got closer together. What started as a gentle pull could suddenly become a crushing force when two magnets came within critical distance. This meant that any attempt to remove them would require perfect precision. One wrong move could trigger a cascade of magnetic attractions, potentially tearing through multiple organ systems in seconds. Our nurses scrambled to gather non-ferromagnetic surgical tools. Standard stainless steel instruments would become projectiles in the magnetic field these rare earth metals generated. The scrub nurse had to verify each instrument individually, a process that precious minutes but was absolutely necessary. One wrong tool could turn this already complicated surgery into an impossible nightmare. Our surgical team huddled around the imaging table, debating entry points. "We need multiple incisions," our lead surgeon argued. "If we try to remove them all through one entry point, we risk them attracting each other and causing more damage during extraction." But multiple incisions meant longer surgery time, increased risk of infection, and a more complicated recovery. Time wasn't on our side. The tissue compression was severe enough that sepsis was a real concern. The longer those magnets stayed in place, the higher the risk of perforation and bacterial leakage into the abdominal cavity. We had 18 minutes to get him into surgery before the risk of tissue death became critical. The surgical planning team brought in specialized imaging software to create a three-dimensional model of the magnetic field interactions. The resulting visualization resembled a complex spider web of force lines, each intersection point representing potential tissue damage. The model revealed several blind spots in our initial assessment, areas where magnetic forces were acting through multiple layers of tissue, creating damage we couldn't directly observe. The patient's vitals were becoming increasingly unstable. His heart rate had climbed to 130 beats per minute, and his blood pressure was starting to drop, classic signs of early shock. The magnets weren't just threatening tissue death, they were compromising blood flow to critical organs. Every movement of his body, every breath, every heartbeat was potentially worsening the situation. The blood work confirmed our worst fears. Elevated white blood cell counts indicated the beginning of an inflammatory response. Lactate levels were rising, suggesting tissue hypoxia in areas where blood flow was compromised. The chemistry panel showed early signs of metabolic acidosis. His body was struggling to maintain basic homeostasis under the assault of these foreign bodies. The CT technician called us back. "There's something else you need to see." He pulled up a sagittal view that made my blood run cold. Some of the magnets had attracted each other through the mesentery, the fatty tissue that supplies blood to the intestines. They were literally creating new pathways through vital structures that were never meant to be connected. The most alarming discovery came when we noticed small gas pockets forming in the compressed tissue spaces. These tiny bubbles signaled the beginning of tissue death, areas where the magnetic pressure had completely cut off blood supply. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was racing. Each new image showed progression of the damage, like watching a slow motion car crash in real time. Our team's vascular specialist pointed out another concerning development. The mesenteric vessels, crucial for intestinal blood supply, were being redirected by the magnetic forces. Some had been pulled into unnatural angles, creating potential kinks in the circulatory system. These vascular distortions could lead to intestinal necrosis even if we managed to remove the magnets quickly. The damage to the vascular architecture might already be permanent. We watched in real time as one cluster shifted slightly, pulling a section of small intestine at least 2 centimeters out of its natural position. The patient's breathing was causing enough movement to continue this deadly reorganization of his internal anatomy. Every minute we spent planning was another minute his body was being reshaped by these powerful magnetic forces. We calculated the magnetic force between the clusters. Each magnet could exert several pounds of attractive force on its neighbors. With 37 of them spread throughout his digestive tract, we were dealing with enough combined force to crush delicate internal tissues. The physics of the situation was mind-boggling. These tiny objects were generating forces strong enough to override the structural integrity of human tissue. Our vascular surgeon joined the consultation, concerned about potential damage to major blood vessels. "If these magnets migrate near the superior mesenteric artery," she warned, "we could lose blood supply to the entire small bowel." The possibility of catastrophic vascular compromise added another layer of urgency to our already critical situation. We began mapping out the locations of major blood vessels in relation to the magnetic clusters, trying to predict where the next deadly attraction might occur. To complicate matters further, the magnetic fields were affecting our monitoring equipment. Standard vital sign monitors had to be moved further from the patient, and even then, their readings fluctuated unpredictably. We needed to establish a safe perimeter around the patient where the magnetic interference wouldn't compromise our ability to track his condition during surgery. The OR layout would have to be completely reconfigured, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging procedure. The team's medical physicist brought in a gas meter to measure the magnetic field strength at various points around the patient's abdomen. The readings were off the charts. Some clusters were generating forces exceeding 1,000 Gauss, more than enough to cause immediate tissue damage where the magnets made contact. These measurements helped us map out safe corridors for surgical access, areas where the magnetic fields were weakest and least likely to interfere with our instruments. The anesthesiologist voiced what we were all thinking. How do we keep the magnets stable during intubation? The movement could cause them to tear through everything. It was a valid concern. Even the act of administering life-saving anesthesia could trigger a catastrophic internal injury. The OR team began their preparations with unprecedented caution. Every metal object in the room had to be accounted for and secured. The surgical lights were adjusted to their maximum brightness. We couldn't risk any shadows obscuring our view of these dangerous objects. The scrub techs laid out specialized polymer-based retractors and titanium alloy forceps that wouldn't be affected by the magnetic fields. As we rushed to prepare the OR, I couldn't help but think about the sheer power we were dealing with. These weren't just foreign bodies to be extracted, they were actively reshaping human anatomy according to the immutable laws of physics. Nature's forces were waging war inside our patient, and we were about to step into the battlefield. The operating room hummed with nervous energy as we donned our leader-prons. Standard surgical tools wouldn't suffice, the magnets would leap toward anything ferromagnetic. We laid out specialized non-magnetic titanium instruments, their dull finish a reminder of the unusual battle ahead. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as I reviewed the CT scans one final time. The magnetic clusters had created multiple points of obstruction, and time was our enemy. Each passing minute increased the risk of perforation and sepsis. I'd performed countless surgeries in my career, but this one would require precision I hadn't needed since my residency days. The standard surgical protocol wouldn't apply here. We were literally fighting against forces of nature. The scrub nurse meticulously arranged the specialized equipment, her hands moving with practiced precision. Each instrument had been carefully selected and tested against powerful magnets to ensure they wouldn't interfere with the delicate procedure ahead. The anesthesiologist monitored the patient's vitals, adjusting medication levels to maintain the perfect balance of unconsciousness and stability. Time was critical. Every minute these magnets remained inside the patient increased the risk of catastrophic tissue damage. The surgical tech completed the final equipment check, confirming each instrument's magnetic resistance. I've seen magnets cause havoc before. A child who swallowed 2 disc magnets ended up with a bowel perforation, but never on this scale. The sheer magnetic force we were about to encounter would make this operation uniquely challenging. Even our surgical masks had to be specially sourced, as the standard ones contained metal nose strips that could interfere with the procedure. Scalpel. I called out, making the first incision through the abdomen. The moment we breached the peritoneum, the extent of the damage became clear. What should have been pink, healthy tissue was mottled with dark patches where blood flow had been compromised. The magnets had formed a grotesque metallic mast, visible through the thinned intestinal walls. The first glimpse inside was enough to make my resident audibly gasp. Years of surgical experience had prepared me for many things, but this was unprecedented. The magnets had created a complex web of pressure points throughout the abdominal cavity. Some areas of the intestine had become so compressed that they resembled tissue paper, while others were swollen and angry from the constant trauma. The magnetic force had drawn sections of bowel together in unnatural configurations, creating adhesions that would challenge even the most skilled surgeon. The intestinal walls had taken on an almost metallic sheen where the magnets pressed against them. Through the translucent tissue, we could see the dark shapes shifting slightly with each pulse of blood through the surrounding vessels. The magnetic force was so strong that our instruments vibrated as we approached each cluster. My first attempt to grasp one of the magnets resulted in the forceps being yanked forward, nearly puncturing the bowel wall. Jesus, my assistant muttered. 2 loops of small intestine had fused together, the powerful magnets pinching the tissue between them like a vise. As I attempted to separate them with non-magnetic forceps, the surrounding tissue began to tear. Blood welled up, obscuring our field of vision. Blood vessels had been compressed for so long that some tissue was already showing signs of necrosis. The magnetic force was strong enough that even with our specialized tools, separating each pair of magnets required careful coordination between myself and my assistant. We had to maintain constant awareness of where each magnet might fly once freed, ready to catch it before it could cause additional damage. The tissue manipulation required an entirely new approach. Traditional surgical techniques rely on being able to grasp and hold tissue steady, but the magnetic forces kept pulling everything in unpredictable directions. Each time we separated a pair of magnets, the remaining clusters would shift position, creating new pressure points and threatening additional tissue damage. The patient's omentum had wrapped around several clusters, nature's attempt to wall off the foreign bodies, making our task even more complex. Suction, I barked, trying to maintain visual contact with the cluster. The magnets resisted separation with shocking force. Each time we pulled one free, it would instantly try to snap back into place or attract to another nearby cluster. It was like trying to perform microsurgery in the middle of a magnetic storm. The OR team worked in perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's needs without speaking. Years of training had prepared us for difficult surgeries, but this was testing our limits. Each freed magnet had to be immediately secured in a specialized container, positioned far enough from the surgical field to prevent interference. The scrub nurse kept count, marking each retrieval on a magnetic board with non-ferrous markers. Each extracted magnet posed its own challenge. Their powerful attraction meant we couldn't simply place them in a standard surgical tray. Instead, we had developed a makeshift system using multiple containers positioned strategically around the OR. The scrub nurse had to maintain constant awareness of the magnetic fields, ensuring that freed magnets didn't suddenly launch themselves across the room. The physical strain of fighting against these invisible forces was evident in the tight grip we maintained on our instruments, our hands cramping from the constant resistance. 20 minutes into the procedure, disaster struck. One of the smaller magnets slipped free and shot toward the colon like a bullet. "Jet the endoscope," I ordered, knowing we couldn't leave even a single magnet behind. The next 22 minutes were spent carefully maneuvering through the colon, fighting against the magnetic attraction while trying not to cause additional tissue damage. The endoscopic retrieval was nerve-wracking. Every slight movement risked tearing the already compromised intestinal wall. The magnet's powerful attraction to its companions meant we couldn't simply grab it, we had to maintain constant counter pressure to prevent it from ripping through tissue in its attempt to rejoin the cluster. The OR fell silent except for the steady beep of monitoring equipment and the occasional clink of instruments. The endoscope's camera revealed the true horror of what these magnets had done. The intestinal mucosa was deeply ulcerated where the magnets had compressed it. In some areas, the tissue had become so thin we could see through to the other side. The magnet's position near a major blood vessel meant one wrong move could trigger catastrophic bleeding. We proceeded millimeter by millimeter, each movement calculated and precise. The endoscopic camera revealed micro tears in the mucosa, creating a landscape that resembled a crater-filled moonscape. Blood seeped from countless pinpoint wounds where the magnets had compressed and eroded the tissue. The intestinal wall's natural peristaltic movement had worked against the patient, causing the magnets to gradually tear through the delicate tissue layers like slow-motion bullets. The patient's blood pressure dropped dangerously low twice during the operation. Each time we had to pause, watching helplessly as the remaining magnets continued their destructive dance. 3 blood transfusions barely kept pace with the blood loss as we worked to repair the damage. "Found another cluster," the assistant surgeon announced, her voice tight with concern. This group had worked its way into the mesentery, threatening the blood supply to a large section of bowel. Removing them was like defusing a bomb. One wrong move could trigger catastrophic bleeding. The mesentery damage was particularly concerning. This fatty tissue, rich with blood vessels and lymphatics, is crucial for intestinal survival. The magnets had created pressure points that threatened to cut off blood supply to multiple segments of bowel. Each extraction required dissection around vital vessels, all while fighting against magnetic forces that could send a freed magnet careening into another vulnerable area. The damage pattern told a story of progressive destruction. Where magnets had been present the longest, the tissue was nearly transparent, worn thin by constant pressure. Newer contact points showed acute inflammation, angry red tissue fighting against the foreign invaders. The mesentery's blood vessels had formed unusual collateral circulation patterns, the body's desperate attempt to maintain blood flow around the obstructed areas. As we worked deeper into the abdomen, the complexity of the damage became apparent. The magnets hadn't just affected the intestines, they had created pressure points against the pancreas and had begun eroding into the retroperitoneal space. The magnetic field had drawn the clusters toward the spine, threatening major blood vessels. Each time we freed a cluster, the remaining magnets would shift, creating new pressure points we had to address immediately. The patient's core temperature began to drop despite the warming blankets. The anesthesiologist called out vitals every few minutes, each update more concerning than the last. The prolonged exposure of the abdominal cavity and ongoing blood loss were taking their toll. We needed to move faster, but rushing could prove fatal. The complexity of the case demanded innovation. Standard surgical techniques proved inadequate against the magnetic forces, forcing us to adapt our approach with each new challenge. We developed a system of counterweights and stabilizing clamps to hold tissue in place while working against the magnetic pull. The OR team's coordination had to be perfect. One person's movement could affect the magnetic fields enough to compromise another's delicate work. The constant tension between magnetic attraction and surgical necessity created an atmosphere of heightened focus I'd rarely experienced in my career. Hour 4 brought the grimmest discovery. Several magnets had created a perforation so severe that a section of intestine was beyond saving. We need to resect, I decided, marking out the damaged section. In total, we would need to remove 60 centimeters of small intestine, a significant loss that would impact the patient's digestion forever. Each resection required careful planning to preserve the remaining blood supply. The magnetic damage had created a complex network of compromised vessels, forcing us to trace each potential blood supply route before making our cuts. The standard anatomical landmarks were distorted by inflammation and adhesions, making each decision a careful balance between necessary removal and vital preservation. The resection was complicated by the compromised blood supply. Identifying viable tissue margins became a challenge as the magnetic damage had created patches of ischemia throughout the bowel. We had to balance between removing enough compromised tissue to prevent future complications and preserving as much functional intestine as possible. Each cut required careful consideration, knowing that too much loss would condemn the patient to a lifetime of malnutrition. The OR lights cast harsh shadows across the surgical field, highlighting the extensive damage we were uncovering. Small blood vessels had been crushed between the magnets, creating areas of micro-hemorrhage that painted the mesentery in shades of purple and black. The surrounding tissue was edematous, swollen from the trauma and decreased lymphatic drainage. Each layer we dissected revealed new challenges. By hour 6, we had retrieved all 37 magnets, but the damage they left behind was staggering. 14 separate resection points, each requiring precise anastomosis to reconnect the healthy tissue. The patient's abdomen looked like a war zone, with multiple repair sites and patches of compromised tissue that we could only hope would heal. The final count of damaged tissue sectors exceeded our initial estimates. Beyond the visible trauma, we discovered micro-tears throughout the mesentery that would require careful monitoring during recovery. The magnetic forces had created patterns of injury, unlike anything documented in medical literature. Some areas showed signs of chronic compression, while others displayed acute tearing from sudden magnetic shifts. The patient's long-term prognosis would depend largely on how well these various injury patterns healed. As we prepared for closure, the OR team discussed the need for detailed documentation. This case would likely become a reference point for future surgeons facing similar challenges. The OR team's stamina was wearing thin, but the complexity of the case demanded unwavering focus. Each anastomosis had to be perfect. The patient's compromised tissue meant we had no margin for error. The scrub nurses count confirmed our worst fears. We had used more suture material than in any previous surgery this month. The mechanical forces exerted by the magnets had been so strong that we needed to reinforce each repair point with additional layers of sutures, hoping to prevent future dehiscence. "It's like a landmine went off in there," I commented as we began closing. The comparison felt apt. These magnets had torn through tissue indiscriminately, leaving a path of destruction that would take months, if not years, to fully heal. As I placed the final suture, I couldn't shake the image of those magnets, still lethal even as they sat in the specimen container, straining to reconnect with each other through the plastic walls. The first 48 hours in ICU were critical. I stood at his bedside, watching the ventilator force air into his lungs. The intubation had been necessary due to the lengthy surgery, but it brought its own complications. By day 3, the telltale signs of pneumonia appeared on his chest. X-rays, a common but dangerous complication of prolonged anesthesia. The nursing staff worked tirelessly, monitoring his vital signs around the clock. I remember one particularly tense night when his oxygen saturation dropped dangerously low. We had to increase his ventilator settings and position him carefully to optimize his breathing. The human body is remarkably resilient, but when pushed to its limits by trauma like this, every system becomes vulnerable. His blood work showed elevated inflammatory markers, and his white blood cell count was climbing steadily, early warning signs that his body was fighting back against multiple threats. The monitors beeped steadily, each sound marking another moment of his fragile stability. During my overnight rounds, I noticed subtle changes in his breathing pattern, the kind of changes that make experienced doctors pause. His blood pressure would fluctuate unexpectedly, dropping suddenly before stabilizing again. The surgical team had warned us about possible complications from the extensive intestinal trauma, but the human body is remarkably unpredictable after such massive interventions. The pneumonia hit him hard. His fever spiked to 104.4 and we had to start him on broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately. The surgical team visited twice daily, checking for any signs of internal bleeding or infection at the resection sites. Each breath seemed to cause him pain, even through the heavy sedation. The nurses monitored his oxygen levels constantly, suctioning his airways to prevent fluid buildup. I ordered chest physiotherapy to help clear his lungs, but progress was painfully slow. The CT scans of his chest revealed the classic ground glass opacities of hospital-acquired pneumonia spreading through both lungs. Each morning, I would review his latest films with the radiology team, tracking the progression of the infection. The antibiotics were working, but slower than we hoped. His immune system, already taxed by the massive abdominal surgery, struggled to mount an effective response. We added antifungal medications prophylactically, knowing that prolonged antibiotic use could lead to opportunistic infections. His blood tests revealed concerning patterns. The liver enzymes were elevated, suggesting strain on an organ that hadn't been directly affected by the magnets. The surgical trauma and medications had created a cascade effect throughout his system. Each morning brought new challenges as we adjusted his treatment plan to address the shifting complications. The ICU team had to carefully balance his fluid levels, watching for signs of third spacing that could indicate deeper tissue damage we couldn't yet see. His recovery was anything but smooth. The first time he fully regained consciousness, the pain was so severe that we had to increase his morphine dosage twice. The human digestive system isn't designed to handle the kind of trauma he's had endured. Each attempt to advance his diet was met with severe cramping and vomiting. The nerve damage from the magnetic compression meant his intestines weren't coordinating properly anymore. The nutritionist joined our team, crafting specialized feeding plans that his damaged system might tolerate. We started with clear liquids, watching anxiously for signs of absorption. Each milliliter counted in these early days. His body, already weakened from the trauma, needed nutrients desperately, but forcing too much too soon could trigger a cascade of complications. The balance was delicate, like walking a tightrope between starvation and system overload. The surgical wounds themselves posed another challenge. Where the magnets had fused together through intestinal walls, the tissue was so damaged that the sutures barely held. We had to reopen 2 sites to address leaks, adding more trauma to his already battered abdomen. The second surgery revealed extensive adhesions forming bands of scar tissue that could cause bowel obstructions later. Each time we went in, we found new complications from the magnetic damage. "Will I ever be able to eat normally again?" he asked during one of our morning rounds. I had to be honest, with 60 centimeters of small intestine gone, his digestive system would never function quite the same. He would need to adapt to a new normal, smaller, more frequent meals, careful monitoring of nutrient absorption, and likely lifelong supplementation. During our conversations about his future dietary needs, I had to explain the complex process of nutrient absorption and how his shortened intestine would affect it. Certain vitamins, particularly B12 and fat-soluble vitamins, would require special attention. We discussed the possibility of regular injections and supplements. His background in engineering helped him grasp the technical aspects, but the reality of these lifelong modifications was clearly overwhelming. The nutritionist prepared detailed meal plans, breaking down exactly how he would need to modify his eating habits to maintain adequate nutrition with his compromised digestive system. The physical therapy sessions were particularly challenging. Even simple movements caused intense pain, but we knew that prolonged immobility would only create more complications. Starting with basic breathing exercises, we gradually progressed to gentle stretches. Each achievement, no matter how small, was celebrated. When he managed to sit upright for the first time without assistance, the entire medical team shared in his triumph, though we could see the cost of that progress etched in the lines of pain on his face. The MRI results from his latest scan showed dark patches throughout his abdominal cavity areas where the magnetic force had literally crushed the delicate blood vessels feeding his intestinal walls. These dead zones would never fully heal, instead forming permanent weak spots in his digestive tract. I explained how these areas might cause unexpected pain or bloating for years to come. His face remained stoic, but his hands trembled as he looked at the images. I spent hours explaining the long-term implications to his family. His wife, a biochemist, understood the medical terminology, but struggled with the reality of what it meant for their future. Their young daughter asked if Daddy would ever be able to eat ice cream again. These conversations were always the hardest part of my job. The medical facts were straightforward, but the human impact was immeasurable. The psychological impact hit harder than the physical pain. During his psychiatric evaluation, he broke down discussing his rare earth magnet collection. "I spent years building it," he said through tears. "No, I can't even look at a refrigerator magnet without feeling sick." We arranged for specialized therapy to address the compulsive behavior that had led to this situation. During one particularly difficult therapy session, he revealed the full extent of his collecting obsession. What had started as a scientific interest in magnetic properties had evolved into an all-consuming passion. He'd spent thousands of dollars acquiring rare earth magnets from specialized dealers worldwide. His basement workshop contained carefully cataloged specimens, each labeled with its magnetic strength and unique properties. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. His dedication to understanding these forces had nearly killed him. His wife brought in his research journals during one session. Pages of meticulous notes detailed magnetic field strengths, interaction patterns, and theoretical applications. The same analytical mind that had documented these properties with such precision had somehow failed to recognize the danger they posed to human tissue. As his therapist noted, this disconnect between intellectual understanding and practical risk assessment was a crucial area for their work together. The psychiatric team discovered that his collecting behavior had begun to affect other areas of his life long before the ingestion incident. His workspace at home had become a shrine to magnetic materials, with precise arrangements that couldn't be disturbed. He'd withdrawn from social activities that conflicted with his collecting schedule. His wife revealed that he'd spent their anniversary money on a rare neodymium magnet set. These patterns pointed to a deeper psychological issue that would require long-term therapeutic intervention. Follow-up imaging revealed the true extent of the long-term damage. The scarring throughout his abdomen mimicked the appearance of Crohn's disease on scans. During one routine check, we discovered something concerning a tiny magnetic fragment, barely visible on X-ray, lodged in his liver. Too small and deeply embedded to safely remove, it would require lifelong monitoring. I never thought magnets could do this, he told me during his 6-week follow-up. They seemed so harmless, just smooth, shiny objects. But inside me, they turned into weapons. His words stuck with me. As a surgeon, I'd seen plenty of foreign body ingestions, but the devastating power of these magnets was unique. The nerve damage left him with chronic pain that standard medications struggled to control. Physical therapy helped somewhat, teaching him techniques to manage the constant discomfort in his abdomen. But certain movements would always trigger sharp pains, a permanent reminder of his near-fatal fascination. The pain management challenges were complex and multifaceted. Traditional opioid medications carried their own risks, especially given his compromised digestive system. We worked with specialists to develop a comprehensive pain protocol that included both pharmacological and non-pharmacological approaches. Physical therapy sessions focused on core strengthening and gentle stretching, but even these basic movements often triggered intense pain responses. The damaged nerve endings sent confused signals, making it difficult to distinguish between normal post-surgical discomfort and signs of potential complications. The rehabilitation process revealed unexpected challenges. Simple activities like bending to tie his shoes or reaching for overhead objects became complex exercises in pain management. His physical therapist developed a specialized program that incorporated his engineering background, using biomechanical principles to help him understand how to modify his movements. This analytical approach helped him regain some sense of control over his recovery, even as his body continued to remind him of its new limitations. The pain management team introduced various treatment options, from nerve blocks to experimental electrical stimulation therapies. Some provided temporary relief, but nothing could fully address the deep structural damage. His wife began researching alternative medicine approaches, acupuncture, biofeedback, anything that might help him cope with the constant discomfort. The medical team supported these efforts, knowing that conventional pain management alone might not be enough for his unique case. His case became a teaching tool. He agreed to speak with medical journals, hoping his experience might prevent similar incidents. "I thought I understood the science," he explained to one interviewer. "The magnetic force, the field strength, it was all just numbers on paper. But inside a human body, those numbers become weapons. Physics doesn't care about flesh and blood." 1 year post-surgery, he returned for his final scheduled follow-up. The physical scars had faded, but the internal damage remained. His digestive system had found a new equilibrium, though far from normal. He had lost his job in engineering, unable to work around the magnetic fields common in his profession. But he had gained something too, a stark understanding of how everyday objects can become lethal under the right circumstances. During his recovery, he began documenting his experience in detail. His engineering mindset approached the healing process like a complex system analysis, tracking every variable and outcome. This documentation proved invaluable for the medical team, offering insights into the patient experience that typical clinical observations might miss. He mapped his pain patterns, dietary responses, and medication effects with the same precision he had once applied to his magnet collection. His experience prompted our hospital to revise its protocols for handling magnetic foreign body ingestions. We developed new guidelines for emergency response teams, emphasizing the unique dangers of magnetic materials. The surgical department invested in specialized non-magnetic tools and imaging equipment. Training sessions now included detailed scenarios based on his case, preparing staff for similar emergencies. The radiology department created a new imaging protocol specifically for suspected magnet ingestions, recognizing that standard approaches might miss crucial details. His recovery journey became a cautionary tale in the medical community. Other hospitals reached out, sharing similar cases they'd encountered. A pattern emerged: highly educated individuals, often with scientific backgrounds, underestimating the destructive potential of powerful magnets. Each case added to our understanding of how these forces interact with living tissue, but the knowledge came at a terrible human cost. "I used to collect magnets because I loved their power," he told me during that final visit. "No, I understand that some forces aren't meant to be contained. They're meant to be respected from a safe distance." As I watched him leave the clinic, I thought about how a simple fascination had nearly cost him his life. In medicine, we often say that knowledge is power, but sometimes knowledge needs to come with a warning label. In my 30 years of emergency medicine, I've seen the dark side of collecting turn deadly more times than I care to count. The magnet case was extreme, but it wasn't unique in its underlying psychology. Adults who intentionally swallow foreign objects often share a common thread, a compulsion that overrides their survival instinct. The human digestive system wasn't designed for these intrusions. When foreign objects enter, the body responds with a cascade of defensive mechanisms. The stomach releases extra acid, the intestines contract more forcefully, and inflammation sets in. But these natural defenses often make the situation worse. I've seen stomach acid corrode metal objects, creating toxic compounds that poison the bloodstream. The intestinal contractions can drive sharp edges into delicate tissue, turning a simple object into a weapon. The psychology behind these cases reveals a disturbing pattern. What begins as a passionate hobby transforms into an all-consuming obsession. I've documented cases where collectors started by simply holding their treasures close, progressing to sleeping with them under their pillows, and eventually incorporating them into their bodies through ingestion. The human mind's capacity for rationalization is remarkable. These individuals often construct elaborate justifications for their actions, convincing themselves that swallowing their collections will create a permanent bond with their beloved objects. The most unsettling cases involve collectors who form emotional bonds with their objects so intense that they view ingestion as a form of preservation. A retired librarian consumed rare manuscript pages, believing she could protect them from decay by keeping them inside her body. Another patient, an antique dealer, swallowed Victorian-era buttons to keep them safe. These individuals often display an altered sense of reality, where the boundaries between collecting and self-destruction blur beyond recognition. Last month, Let treated a professor who had swallowed his entire coin collection over 2 weeks. The week before that, a software engineer came in with 12 Liligio heads lodged in his esophagus. But nothing compares to the battery ingestions. When a lithium battery touches stomach acid, it creates an electrical current that can burn through tissue in hours. I'll never forget the teenager who swallowed his watch battery collection. We had exactly 120 minutes to save his esophagus. The battery cases particularly disturbed me because of their deceptive nature. A coin might cause discomfort, but a battery creates an electrical circuit with body fluids, generating hydroxide that burns through tissue like acid. I've seen batteries bore holes through the esophageal wall in less than 4 hours. Even after removal, the damage continues as chemical burns spread through surrounding tissues. We've had to perform emergency thoracotomy procedures when batteries breached the chest cavity, turning a simple swallowing incident into a life-threatening crisis. One particularly disturbing trend I've noticed is the increasing sophistication of the objects being swallowed. Modern collectors aren't just ingesting simple items, they're consuming complex electronic components, rare earth materials, and industrial-grade substances. A recent patient had swallowed several microchips from vintage computers, believing he could preserve their processing power within his body. The chemical interaction between the silicon components and his digestive system created a unique medical emergency we hadn't encountered before. The real danger with batteries lies in their deceptive nature. Unlike sharp objects that cause immediate pain, batteries can sit quietly for hours before unleashing their destruction. By the time patients feel the burning sensation, significant damage has already occurred. We've had to develop specialized imaging protocols just to track the spread of chemical burns through tissue layers. Each case teaches us something new about the interaction between industrial materials and human biology. The battery cases haunt our emergency department. Each one represents a desperate race against chemical reactions we can't control. We've developed specialized protocols just for battery retrievals, a dedicated OR team on standby, direct routes mapped from triage to surgery, and relationships with nearby hospitals that stock rare antidotes. When someone swallows a battery, every second counts. The damage spreads like wildfire through delicate tissue, leaving behind a wake of destruction that can take years to heal. The surgical landscape has evolved to meet these challenges. We've developed specialized tools with magnetic shielding, allowing us to safely remove metallic objects without creating additional damage. But these innovations came at a cost. Each new tool represents lessons learned from past tragedies. Each new tool in our arsenal represents countless hours of engineering and testing. We've developed flexible scopes with electromagnetic dampening fields, retrieval baskets that can withstand intense magnetic forces, and specialized forceps designed to grip objects without crushing them. The most critical advancement has been the development of real-time imaging systems that can track multiple foreign bodies simultaneously, allowing us to predict and prevent dangerous interactions during removal. The evolution of our surgical approach reflects the increasing complexity of these cases. We've moved beyond simple extraction to consider the chemical and physical properties of each swallowed object. Magnets require different tools than batteries, which require different approaches than organic collections. Each new case forces us to innovate, to think beyond traditional medical training and into the realm of materials science. These tools represent millions in research and development, countless hours of testing, and unfortunately, lessons learned from failed attempts. Each new device in our arsenal comes with its own history of trial and error. We've seen magnetically shielded scopes snap under pressure, protect coatings fail at crucial moments, and retrieval baskets collapse when faced with unexpected resistance. Every failure taught us something vital about the physics of removal, about how different materials interact under stress, about the limits of human tissue. The engineering challenges of extraction have pushed medical technology to its limits. We've had to develop new imaging techniques that can distinguish between different types of metals in real time, allowing us to predict how objects will interact before we begin removal. The magnetic resonance patterns of various materials have become required knowledge for emergency surgeons, turning us into impromptu physicists during critical procedures. The psychological patterns we observe in these cases often mirror addiction pathways. The initial thrill of acquiring a new piece for their collection triggers dopamine release. Over time, simply owning the objects isn't enough. They need more intimate contact to achieve the same emotional satisfaction. This escalation follows a predictable pattern, but knowing the pattern hasn't made it easier to prevent the behavior. The reward pathways activated by collecting aren't fundamentally different from those triggered by gambling or substance abuse. Each new acquisition provides a hit of dopamine, creating a cycle of seeking and satisfaction. When collectors progress to ingestion, they're often chasing an intensified version of that same high. The physical incorporation of their treasured objects creates a powerful psychological fusion of identity and collection. I've witnessed patients experience genuine withdrawal symptoms when separated from their collections, complete with anxiety, tremors, and intense cravings. The psychiatric component of these cases reveals a complex interplay between collecting behavior and risk-taking. Some patients display classic symptoms of picker disorder, an inexplicable urge to eat non-food items. Others exhibit a more focused obsession with specific objects. The neurochemistry shows striking similarities. Both conditions trigger the same reward pathways in the brain that fuel addiction. The brain scans of these patients reveal patterns similar to those seen in obsessive-compulsive disorder. Areas controlling impulse regulation show decreased activity, while regions associated with reward and pleasure light up intensely when patients discuss their collections. This neurological evidence helps explain why traditional interventions often fail. We're not just fighting conscious decisions, we're battling hardwired neural pathways. The neurological patterns we observe often mirror those seen in extreme sports enthusiasts, a constant seeking of higher risks for greater emotional rewards. Some collectors describe a euphoric state when incorporating their treasures into their bodies, a feeling that overshadows any rational consideration of danger. This altered state of consciousness makes traditional intervention strategies largely ineffective. I've consulted on cases where collectors gradually escalated from touching to tasting to swallowing their treasures. The progression often starts innocently: a coin collector who licks ancient metals to authenticate them, a bead enthusiast who holds pieces in their mouth while working. The brain begins associating the objects with pleasure, creating a dangerous feedback loop. The legal ramifications of these cases have reshaped consumer safety laws. After a series of magnet ingestions in children, toy manufacturers faced unprecedented restrictions on magnetic component strength. But adults find ways around these regulations, seeking out industrial grade materials for their collections. These regulations sparked an underground market for high-powered magnets, particularly among adult collectors. Some manufacturers began marketing their products as scientific specimens or industrial components to bypass toy safety standards. This regulatory cat and mouse game has led to increasingly dangerous products finding their way into collectors' hands. The strongest magnets we've encountered in medical cases were never intended for consumer use. They were meant for industrial machinery or scientific equipment. The legal landscape surrounding these cases becomes more complex each year. Manufacturers now face strict requirements for warning labels and safety features, but determined collectors find ways to circumvent these protections. We've seen cases where individuals modified child-safe containers to access dangerous materials, or imported restricted items through underground markets. The drive to collect overwhelms rational consideration of legal consequences. The global nature of collecting communities has complicated enforcement efforts. Online forums share methods for acquiring restricted materials, and international shipping makes tracking dangerous items nearly impossible. We've treated patients who ordered rare earth magnets from overseas manufacturers, circumventing local safety regulations. The internet has created a perfect storm where obsessive collectors can always find what they're seeking, regardless of legal status. International medical databases now track these cases, revealing patterns that cross cultural and geographical boundaries. The phenomenon isn't limited to any particular demographic or socioeconomic group. We've seen successful professionals, academic researchers, and even medical personnel fall victim to this compulsion. The global nature of collecting communities has created a perfect storm where dangerous practices can spread rapidly through online networks. The most challenging aspect of treating these patients is addressing the underlying compulsion. Physical removal of the objects is only half the battle. Many collectors, once recovered, face an agonizing choice: continuing their passion from a safe distance or abandoning it entirely to avoid temptation. The psychological aftercare has become as crucial as the surgical intervention. Many patients experience profound depression upon realizing they can never safely handle their collections again. The compulsion doesn't simply vanish after treatment, it morphs and adapts. We've seen patients transfer their obsession to new, equally dangerous objects, requiring constant vigilance and support from mental health professionals. The most successful recoveries often involve finding safe alternatives that satisfy the collecting impulse without risking physical harm. In the wake of high-profile cases, support groups have emerged for people struggling with collection-related compulsions. They share strategies for maintaining boundaries between appreciation and obsession. Some have transitioned to digital collecting, photographing objects rather than possessing them physically. Recovery programs have begun incorporating elements from addiction treatment, recognizing that the urge to collect and consume objects shares neurological pathways with substance dependence. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps patients identify trigger situations and develop alternative coping mechanisms. Some facilities now offer specialized programs that combine medical monitoring with psychological support, creating safe spaces for collectors to explore their passion without risking their health. Treatment protocols now incorporate elements from both addiction medicine and trauma therapy. Many patients exhibit symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder after surviving severe complications, yet simultaneously struggle with intense cravings to resume their collecting behavior. This dual diagnosis requires a delicate balance of medical intervention and psychological support, often extending treatment timelines well beyond physical recovery. The medical community has had to adapt our approach to these cases. Standard protocols for foreign body removal don't account for the psychological attachment patients feel to their swallowed collections. We've learned to balance physical treatment with emotional support, understanding that we're not just removing objects, we're asking patients to let go of something deeply meaningful to them. Looking back at the magnet case, I see it as a turning point in how we approach collection-related emergencies. It taught us that the most dangerous situations often arise not from reckless behavior, but from a gradual normalization of risk. Collectors don't typically swallow their treasures on a whim, they cross that line one small decision at a time.